Hi guys, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the TOG II, the Tier 6 British Premium Heavy Tank. This tank is currently available from the tech tree for 3,500 gold and is currently available in the gift shop. Now I am stressing the word currently because in a couple of weeks the TOG II is being removed from purchase. You're not going to be able to buy this tank with the introduction of 9.7. So if you're watching this video pretty soon after it was released, the TOG II is still available for purchase, but if you're watching it in a fortnight or even 3 weeks time, the TOG II will be gone from both the tech tree and the shop. If you already own the tank, you're going to still own it, you're still going to be able to play it, but for newer players, you're not going to be able to buy this tank anymore. I'm sure that Wargaming may make it available in future as special bundle packs in the gift shop, but it's definitely not going to be as easy to pick up as it currently is. And the question we're going to be asking today is this tank currently worth 3,500 gold? So let's talk about the history of the tank. And the TOG II was a prototype. Only one was ever built, and that one still exists today in Bovington Tank Museum. But for a tank of which only one was ever built and never even reached testing phase, this tank has a huge amount of history. In 1939, after the British had retreated from Dunkirk in the face of the German Blitzkrieg and British armour had underperformed, the British Ministry of Defence went into overdrive. They put the Churchill line of tanks into production before they had been fully tested, but another thing they did was they believed that a land war on mainland Europe would go the same way as it did in World War I, and that was with a series of trench warfare battles. And as a result, one of the things they did was they went back to the original designers of the first tanks. The first tanks, the Mark I and Mark II, that were introduced around 1916. They went back to the original engineers and they asked them could they draw up plans just in case World War II descended into trench warfare again. This group of engineers, they did have a technical term, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. They decided to give themselves a nickname and they called themselves the Old Gang. The Old Gang. So that's where the name TOG came from. They put forward a few different designs. Two were built. The TOG I was basically an up-armoured, up-engined version of the original Mark I and Mark II tanks from 1916. It came with a Matilda turret and a 75mm gun. However, due to engine issues, it ended up being scrapped shortly after it entered trials. Another tank they designed, and again, history-wise, it was built by the original Foster & Co. They're the same company who actually built the first tanks in World War I. Foster & Co. built the TOG II, another TOG design. The TOG II was a very, very unusual tank. It was designed for trench warfare, as I've already mentioned, and it was very, very long as a result. The TOG is over 10 meters long. It is over 3 meters wide, and it is over 3 meters high. You could see a lot of influence from the World War I tanks on the TOG. For example, these doors on the side of the tank weren't actually designed to be doors. These were actually designed to be sponsons, or basically side turrets for machine guns. So there were sponsons supposed to be added to the sides of the TOG II, but it never got that far. Another unusual feature of the TOG II was its engine. It came with a 600 horsepower V12 diesel engine, but the engine didn't actually power the tank. The engine was designed to power two electrical generators, which in turn powered two electrical motors, and in turn those two electrical motors powered the tracks. So it was an electric powered tank. It didn't have mechanical transmission and it didn't even have a gearbox. It only had one speed, forward. It only had one reverse speed, back. And that's one of the things that annoys me a little bit. I suppose maybe someone out there who is more of a tank historian than I am could correct me on this, but as an electric powered tank that doesn't have a gearbox or mechanical transmission, the forward speed or the acceleration should be identical to the reverse speed. So the tank does have 14 kilometers an hour advance or forward speed, which is historically accurate, but its reverse speed in-game is only 7 kilometers an hour. I believe the reverse speed should be 14 kilometers an hour. It should be identical to the acceleration due to the fact it doesn't have mechanical transmission or a gearbox, but that's just me. Maybe someone could correct me on it. Continuing with the history of the tank, In 1942, a series of turrets were placed on the tank. Between 1942 and 1944, there were various turrets mounted on the tank to try and basically keep it up to date with tank warfare. The tank that was the turret that was eventually decided on in 1944 was the same turret that came on the Challenger, the Cruiser Mark 8 Challenger. However, that tank does exist in game. It is the Tier 7 British TD, but as I say, the tank unfortunately could not keep up with the pace of tank warfare in World War II. It was already obsolete by 1942, and eventually it stopped being upgraded in 1944 and was consigned to the pages of history without even entering tests and without ever seeing combat. But the TOG II has a lot of history attached to it. It's a very, very interesting tank, but that's pretty much it. Now, normally at this stage of the review, I like to compare a premium tank against all its premium tank rivals. Unfortunately, the TOG II doesn't have any rivals. There are no other Tier 6 premium heavy tanks in the game. Now, the TOG II is a very, very unique tank. It is a heavy tank, but it doesn't play like any other heavy tank. We're going to be comparing it against the Churchill 7, its cousin for the British. We're going to be comparing it against the KV-85, the T-150, and the KV-2. They're the only other Tier 6 heavy tanks I own. Unfortunately, I sold the Arl and the M6, but straight away you could see that the TOG II is very, very unusual. It comes with an absolute huge amount of hit points. It comes with almost 40% more hit points than any of the other heavy tanks. The Churchill 7 gets a lot of hit points for a Tier 6 heavy, but even still, the TOG II gets almost 500 hit points more than it. It gets an absolutely huge amount of hit points, and like I say, it's an absolutely huge tank. It comes in at about 83 tons for me, and that is significantly heavier than any of the other tanks up here. Even a tank like the T-150 at 55 tons is considered a heavy tank, but yeah, the TOG II makes the T-150 look up like a positively light tank. The engine power, again, the engine is very unusual in the TOG II, as I've already described while I was talking about its history. On paper, it comes with a 600 horsepower engine, and that is, again, one of the better engines. The T-150 gets a heavier engine, but it's not a great engine. It may be comparable to a lot of the other tanks up here, with the exception of maybe the Churchill 7, but due to the fact it weighs almost twice as much as any of the tanks up here, the horsepower to weight ratio is incredibly bad. It accelerates quite poorly. The top speed is also incredibly bad. I mean, the Churchill 7 is a very, very slow tank at 20 kilometers an hour, but the TOG II is even slower at 14 kilometers an hour. The traverse speed is actually comparable to any of the other heavies. It's comparable to the Churchill, T-150, and KV-2. Only the KV-85 is a faster traverse. Another reason the TOG II is a little bit unusual is its turret traverse speed, which is 32 degrees per second. It's got the fastest turret traverse speed of any of the Tier 6 heavy tanks up here. The Churchill 7 comes quite close to it with 30 degrees per second, but as I say, the TOG II, very, very unusual, and it's got the Russian tanks well beaten with regards to turret traverse. The view range, again, is not a strength on the TOG. It's got 360 meters of view range, but compared to any of the other Tier 6 heavy tanks, it's got similar view range to the Churchill, and it beats the 3 Russian tanks. The view range on the TOG II is actually okay, and I do know some TOG drivers that place or put coated optics or even binocs on a TOG II. The view range is quite good for a heavy tank, but then again, lots of tanks at Tier 6 have better view range, so I wouldn't consider it a strength, but it's definitely not a weakness. And again, its signal range is very, very good. It's got the best signal range of any of the Tier 6 heavy tanks up here. Now, the armor, we're going to go into the armor in a lot more detail in a moment, but the armor on paper doesn't look that bad. When you look at the hull armor, it's got 76mm on front, 76 on the side, and 50 on the rear. The Churchill 7 is better armored on hull, but it's got similar armor on paper to maybe the KV-85. It's even better in some ways. The T-150 is definitely better armored, but it's also got similar hull armor to maybe the KV-2 on paper. But you've got to remember, the KV-85 and the KV-2 have some angling going on, and the TOG II is quite flat. The turret armor is also something that is quite good. If you look at the turret armor on the TOG II, it is 114mm on front. Now, only the Churchill 7 has that beaten with 152. 114mm on the front of the turret is actually better than the KV-85s, better than the T-150s, and better than the KV-2s. The turret armor is quite good, and when people talk about the TOG II, they usually consider it a tank that has no armor. On paper, the armor is actually looking okay, and we're going to go into Tank Viewer in just a moment. But 76 on the side of the turret is actually quite good compared to some of the other heavies, and 53 on the rear is, well, fairly poor. But you can see that the armor, as I say, on paper is not looking that bad. Now, I think the armor on the TOG II, while not great, is definitely troll. I think the armor can perform a lot better than people give it credit for, but again, it's one of these tanks where you need to have an experienced player in it in order to take advantage of what little armor you have. However, it's not terrible. In some situations, the armor on the TOG II can be quite good. For example, it has 114mm of frontal turret armor. Now that means that this tank can go hull down, and the fact it gets 10 degrees of gun depression means you can use it as a hull down tank, you can use it as a hill warrior, assuming you actually have the speed to get to the top of a hill. You can actually go hull down, and I think the turret armor is surprisingly good, even for a tier 6 heavy tank. 76mm of armor refers to basically the front and side of the tank. You can see that the front of the tank is mainly, other than 114, the turret cheeks are 76mm, the front of the tank is 76mm. There are some weak spots, but the 76mm also extends down quite a lot of the side of the tank. So 76mm is not bad. You can side scrape, you can angle with 76mm of armor, and even with all of these weak spots on the front and side of the tank, these weak spots aren't that much weaker. They're 63mm thick, so any of the weak spots on the front of the tank and on the side of the tank are going to be 63mm thick. So again, you can angle, you can side scrape, but you need to be very, very careful when you do it. 53mm of armor refers to the front of the turret, and again, when you're using this tank with its gun depression, you're using it as hill warrior, you can be penned here, but it's quite a small target. When you're facing a TOG II frontally, you can hit it, but unfortunately, there are very, very few guns the TOG II faces that are going to be able to overmatch it. And the rear of the turret is 53mm thick, so if you get to the rear of a TOG, that might be where you want to shoot it because it's very, very flat. And the reason I'm saying if you're behind a TOG and want to go for the rear of the turret is because the rear of the tank itself, even though it gets less armor, it's 50mm of armor compared to 53 on the rear of the turret, it's angled. So the rear of the turret is 53mm, but it's very, very flat, and the rear of the TOG II is very, very angled. It is surprisingly how well the rear of this tank can bounce shots, particularly against lower tier tanks. It is very, very well angled, and again, historically, I think it's supposed to have maybe about 25mm of rear armor. Maybe someone could correct me on that, but in game we've got 50, and it's well armored, or well angled, so you will find yourself bouncing. You can reverse side scrape and drive in reverse in the TOG II, and it can be quite effective, but if you do get behind a TOG II, probably the safest place to shoot him is in the back of the turret. As I say, that's only 53mm thick and it's flat. But 50mm also refers to the hull of the tank. So basically, if a TOG is facing you frontally and decides to angle a little bit, it is possible to put shots in here, track the TOG, and be able to pen its hull. But there's really no point in doing that for a reason I'm going to show you in a moment. 40mm refers to the tracks themselves, so the tracks are considered 40mm of spaced armor. And again, the tracks are surprisingly good. They can absorb a lot of shots. You can get shot in the tracks, it can pen your hull, it will do damage, but at other times the tracks on the TOG II will absorb damage, and they can be quite good. But the reason I'm saying you've got to be very careful when you're you can side scrape in this tank, but you need to be very careful, is that you've only got 25mm of armor, basically on the entire engine deck, so RT loves shooting TOGs, but also the hull just behind the tracks. So the tracks don't extend out from the tank. Like a lot of British tanks, you can shoot directly. If a TOG is facing you, could shoot them directly in the tracks. The shot will pen the tracks, will pen the hull, and that's only 25mm thick. So you could go for the shot here at an angle, try and track him and pen 40mm of armor in the hull, but you might as well just shoot him here, track him, and pen 25mm of hull armor. So if you're facing down a TOG frontally, be aware the tracks can absorb shots, but if you've got a high caliber weapon, you should be able just to pen the TOG directly through the tracks, track him in place, and do damage before starting to work on the front of the tank. 19mm refers to the roof of the tank, and again, like I say, RT loves shooting TOGs. If you're in a TOG, it's slow moving, it's a big target, RT is absolutely going to decimate you. And the reason I think the armor is underestimated on the TOG II is its spaced armor. I've got the spaced armor hidden here, but let's remove that. You can see that the side of this tank has spaced armor. So 63.5mm of spaced armor just under the tracks here. And that means you can effectively side scrape very, very well in a TOG. If you're an experienced player, you know how to side scrape, you know how to reverse side scrape. The armor can be surprisingly good on a TOG. So a lot of people will say it gets a lot of hit points because it needs to trade hit points for armor, and it trades hit points for doing damage to enemy tanks. Yep, that's true in some cases, but in a lot of cases, if you know what you're doing, you get a lot of hit points and you can make the armor work for you. You can side scrape because you've got spaced armor. The side armor is not terrible, and you can reverse side scrape again because the side armor is not terrible. There is spaced armor and your tracks can absorb shots, and as I say, the angling at the rear of the tank is very, very good. So that's why you see a lot of TOG II drivers or experienced TOG II drivers actually driving their TOGs in reverse in some cases, because in some cases the armor is better from the rear. Yeah, I think the TOG II has armor, but you just have to know how to use it. So let's talk about the gun, and I think the gun on the TOG II is one of its biggest strengths. It's got a great gun. It's a 17-pounder. But you know what else is a 17-pounder? The Churchill 7. So we're going to compare just very, very quickly the Churchill 7's gun to the TOG's gun. Now, usually premium tanks aren't quite as good as fully upgraded tanks of the same tier, and it starts off, both tanks have 17-pounders, they're both 76.2mm guns, but you can see that the rate of fire on the Churchill is slightly faster than it is on the TOG. The TOG's rate of fire is very, very good, but the Churchill does have it beaten. However, then the big differences happen, because the TOG II gets 171mm of penetration with its standard AP, compared to 148 on the Churchill. It gets 239mm of penetration with its premium ammo, compared to 208 with the Churchill. It also gets more alpha damage. It gets 150 alpha damage compared to 140. Both guns have the same accuracy, they have the same aim time, but overall I think the gun on the TOG II is much, much better. And that's also down to the fact that TOG II gets special matchmaking. So this gun only faces tier 6s and tier 7s, whereas this gun needs to face tier 6, tier 7, and tier 8 tanks. So I think the gun on the TOG II is surprisingly good. A lot of people underestimate it. The rate of fire combined with that alpha damage means that the TOG II gets around 1800 DPM. Now you can boost that with equipment, for example with a gun rammer and with vents, so you can get the DPM up to close to 2000 with crew skills and equipment. But on the other hand, when you compare it to, say, something like the KV-85, the KV-85 using the 100mm gun actually gets more DPM. So a KV-85 with a 100mm gun has DPM of around about 2000. So the DPM on a KV-85 is better than it is on a TOG, but the TOG's armor can be surprisingly troll. It also has a fast rate of fire, and it has a huge hit point pool. So even though a tank like the KV-85 on paper should be a good test for a TOG II because it has better DPM and better armor, a TOG II versus a KV-85 is no contest. The TOG II has a lot of hit points it can rely on. It's got a rapid firing gun, and even though the DPM on a KV-85 is better than it is on a TOG II, the TOG II can basically wipe out a KV-85, and it's 870 hit points, a lot quicker than a KV-85 can do 1400 hit points worth of damage to a TOG II. So yeah, I think the TOG II's gun is very, very good, and when you combine it with the fact it's got 114mm of frontal turret armor and 10 degrees of gun depression, I think a lot of people underestimate the gun on a TOG II. It is very, very good. So let's see this gun and this engine in action. We are here on Himmelsdorf. We are top tier. It's a very, very nice game for a TOG II. And there's a TOG II platoon on the enemy team. So they have 3 TOGs. We have 2 TOGs. I'm platooned with Beyond D. And Tanza is being a softie by playing Artie. Usually it's much better to platoon in 3 TOG platoons, but I'll get into that later in the review. But we're going uphill, and you can see we're doing a whole 9 kilometers an hour. Now the TOG II is probably one of the slowest tanks in the game. It is painfully slow. And that's why it likes maps like Himmelsdorf, because they're small maps. You can get into the action very, very quickly, at least quickly for a TOG. TOGs really suffer on big open maps because, like all slow tanks, you can't get into position quickly, you can't get out of position quickly. If you try to go to where heavy tanks would normally go, they end up, you end up basically not getting there. But something the TOG II is very good at that I haven't mentioned so far is the fact you can shoot on the move. You can see me taking out the Keyhoe. I have not stopped moving. So, seeing TOGs on the enemy team,
Ready to fire.
I assume that their TOG II platoon is coming up the hill, and you can see I'm already being targeted by Artie. Artie love shooting TOGs.
Target unlocked.
So we're just moving forward. And I really want to work this corner, but unfortunately we've got a Sherman Jumbo who's moved here. So I'm trying to do some reverse side scraping, and there's Artie again. But moving forward, oh look, Su-85I, weak spot, but Artie is constantly focused on me because I'm in a TOG. But we're moving forward, and you can see there, we've gone for a shot through the track, showed you that in Tank Viewer. Shooting through the track, doing damage on the hull. Unfortunately, I failed to track the TOG II, but we're just moving forward, weak spot, and somehow I managed to bounce. But I've actually bounced a T-34, and that's a HE hit from my own KV-1S. I don't know what the heck he was trying to do there. But we're just looking for shots. You can see the gun is performing well. We're on 2 kills. And I don't get a shot at the weak spot on the T-34, but a lot of these tanks around the corner are on quite low health. So, aiming, and I don't know, that corner badly modeled. Don't know how that shot missed. That shot goes high. Remember, it's not the most accurate of guns, but it is quite accurate. And the rate of fire is very good. So there's 3 kills. Enemy TOG gone. T-50 tries to run. We've got the rate of fire. We've got the aim time to take him out. And I can trade shots with this TOG II. I'm not afraid to trade shots because I've got a lot more health. So there's kill number 5. And again, we're, I would say rushing. We don't rush anywhere in a TOG, but moving around a corner, again, shooting on the move. The TOG is very good at shooting on the move. And there's kill number 6, and I'm quick enough to get around, aim, and there's kill number 7. So, yeah, 7 kills in a TOG, and Artie is still focused on me. It's just taken out my gun. So, Artie HE does do a lot of module, a lot of crew damage. But we're moving forward. I'm looking for kill number 8. Only 3 tanks left on the enemy team. But we've got the accuracy, we've got the aim time, we've got the rate of fire, and there's a Radley Walters. So now there is only 1 enemy tank left on the enemy team. It's a TOG II, and here's the downside to the engine power. I'm going downhill. I'm only doing 18 kilometers, 17 kilometers an hour. And there's no way I'm going to be able to wrap up at the end of this game. So the TOG II has all the usual problems of a slow tank. Getting into position at the beginning of games, getting out of position, and then at the end of games trying to wrap up. But you'll notice that I'm still on half health. I'm on 743 health. I've got over half my health left, even though I was hit 4 times by enemy Artie. That's because I'm using a super heavy spall liner. Beyond D put up a big fight on the hill as well. He's still on 500 hit points. And this is why TOGs love platooning. This is why the gun on the TOG is quite good. That's a game you guys won't have seen before, but the engine power absolutely sucks. and the TOG II loves small maps as a result, but the gun is very, very good. So let's talk about crew, and the TOG II has an absolutely huge crew. You've got a commander, you've got a gunner, you've got a driver, you've got a radio operator, and you've got 2 loaders. You've got 6 crew members in here. So does it make it a good crew trainer? Well, we'll check out the tech tree. And it's not perfect when you first start off. The first British heavy tank is the Churchill 1, so we'll drag up the TOG first of all. Take a look at the crew, and we'll look at the Churchill 1. Now, the Churchill 1 is a little bit of a pain because it doesn't match the TOG 2. You could train up most of the crew in here, but you are going to need an extra gunner from somewhere for the Churchill 1. So it's not perfect for the Churchill 1. You can train up 4 of the 5, and you're going to be left over with a spare gunner. However, things get a lot better when you take a look at the Churchill 7. It has exactly the same crew layout. In fact, you get an extra loader. You need an extra loader for the TOG, but you could train up a full Churchill 7 crew in the TOG. Same goes for the Black Prince. You could train up a full Black Prince crew in the TOG. You'll just need an extra loader. And then when it comes down to the higher tier British tanks, you only have 4 crew members, all of whom can be actually trained in the TOG. You've got a commander, gunner, driver, and loader, all the way up to tier 10, which can be trained from the TOG. Now, one thing I'm going to say here that I've never ever said before is the TOG II is an absolutely amazing crew trainer. In fact, most of my British crews have at least 1 crew member or multiple crew members that have been through the TOG II at one stage. And that's the same for my British TDs. I didn't have an AT-15 for a long time. But if you take a look at, so for example, the AT-15, you could see that the crew layout for the AT-15 matches the TOG II perfectly. It's the same with the Tortoise. It matches perfectly. So what I did, or what I've done in the past, is I've trained up new crews in the TOG II and moved them to tanks that aren't heavy tanks. So I've taken the 20% hit retraining for credits, but I've trained up a heck of a lot of British crews in the TOG II. I recently moved my Carnarvon crew from the Carnarvon to the FV215B at tier 10 when I unlocked it. I needed to start training up a new Carnarvon crew. Carnarvon only has 4 crew members. You can see we're progressing nicely. We've got 3 crew members here that are on 89%, but then you'll see that we have another Carnarvon member down here who actually has 2 skills. And that's because he was a spare loader from the TOG. And I end up having lots and lots of spare crew members, and I train up a lot of crew members in the TOG when I play it. Most of my British tanks have at least 1, if not 2, crew members that have originally trained up in the TOG, and for some tanks the entire crew were originally played in the TOG. I use this tank a lot for crew training. I don't play it all that often, but it's a very, very good crew trainer, not just for British heavy tanks, but also for other lines if you are stuck and are willing to take an XP hit when you transfer the crew over. Usually, when you get to the higher tiers, the TOG II is capable of training up 1.5 crews per game. It's a very, very good crew trainer, and that would be probably one of its biggest strengths and one of the reasons I would suggest getting a TOG. If you're serious about training up British crews and you don't have that many British crews to begin with, the TOG II is a slow, horrible tank to play. I haven't got to the summary yet, but I'm being honest. The TOG II is a very, very situational tank. It's not a lot of fun to play, but really the difference between the TOG II's performance with a 100% crew and the difference with a 75% crew isn't fantastic. I mean, it's still a slow, pain-in-the-ass tank to play with a 100% crew, just like it is a slow, pain-in-the-ass tank to play when you've got a 75% crew in here. So I've put a lot of 75% crews in this tank from scratch. I've trained them up from scratch, and as I say, most of my British crews or crew members have spent time in the TOG at one stage. It is a very, very good crew trainer. So let's talk about equipment, and thankfully there aren't too many equipment choices, but starting off, super heavy spall liner, very, very expensive, 750,000 credits. If you do get a TOG, I absolutely recommend a super heavy spall liner. Yes, RT is going to be able to hit you, and yes, lots of tanks that you face at tier 4, tier 5, tier 6, and tier 7 are using derp guns, but this tank gets a lot of HE fired at it because a lot of tanks firing HE are expecting to hit and pen a TOG, and while a lot of them can, what actually happens is a lot of them won't actually pen you. They will hit your space armor, they will hit your tracks, and as a result they don't actually pen you. But because you've only got about 20 millimeters of armor around the top of your tank, you end up taking a lot of splash damage. And splash damage is very, very bad in a TOG. It means that your crews get knocked out, it means your modules get knocked out very, very easily. So as a result, I really do recommend a super heavy spall liner. Next up, we've got vents, which I do have mounted on the tank. Again, it improves basically my tank all around, but if there was one piece of equipment that I actually have taken off and replaced in the past, it is vents. When I get a decent crew in a TOG and they get up to 100%, I usually put vents on the tank, but in the past I've not used used vents, and I've actually used a toolbox instead. But vents, perfectly viable choice to get your aim time, get your rate of fire up, improve your view range a little bit. It's perfectly viable, depends on how you decide to play the tank. But if there was one piece of equipment, as I say, I removed to replace with another one, it is vents. I do it on occasion when I'm training up a brand new crew, because one of the items that is very, very important on a TOG II is its toolbox. Again, as I say, this tank takes a lot of module damage, but it also takes a lot of track damage. You can use your tracks to absorb a lot of shots if you're side scraping in the TOG, and as a result, if you've got a brand new crew in the TOG, you're definitely going to want to have a toolbox on it. Once my crew get trained up to 100% and I start building up my repair skills, then I usually replace the toolbox with a vents. But again, completely up to you. Toolbox is completely and utterly viable depending on the crew you have in the tank. Filling the tanks with CO2 is a complete and utter waste of time. You don't get set on fire all that often. Improving the hit points of your tracks, again, complete waste of time and credits. Yes, you do get tracked quite a lot, but I think there are much better pieces of equipment than vertical coil springs. Enhanced gun length drive is a possibility. Again, aiming time is about 2.3 seconds. You can improve that with an enhanced gun length drive, but I think there are much better pieces of equipment, and it's really up to you on how you decide to play the tank. Coated optics is viable. Usually, most of my tanks are going to have at least one piece of equipment that improves my view range. The TOG doesn't, because I went for a super heavy spall liner over optics. 360 meters is quite good for a tier 6 heavy tank anyway. It's not brilliant. Lots of tanks are going to have better view range. I do know some TOG drivers that play with coated optics or binocs, but I went for other equipment choices. Coated optics is perfectly viable because the TOG II can be played on the move. It's usually on the move. It takes forever to get anywhere. You're going to be shooting on the move. You're going to be constantly on the move, and coated optics will get you up to close to 400 meters of view range. So I do know players that use coated optics, so it's perfectly viable. I also know players that play the TOG II very defensively. They play it as a sniper. They sit at the back of the map, very rarely leave spawn. They try and go hull down near the back of the map, and they basically just snipe. And in those situations, binocs are much better. They will get your view range well over 400 meters. So perfectly viable choice. All depends on how you decide to play the tank. And medium caliber gun rammer to improve your DPM by about 10% is an absolute must for me. In a lot of situations, you end up head to head against enemy tanks, and you simply got to use your huge HP pool. You've got to use your trawl armor, try to get them to bounce a couple of shots by side scraping, but you basically need to out DPM them. You need to kill them before they can kill you, and increasing your DPM by 10% with a gun rammer is an absolute must for me. A wet ammo rack is a perfectly viable piece of equipment for a TOG II, and the reason is this tank takes a lot of damage. A lot of the tanks that are going to be shooting at a TOG II are going to have no problems penning it, and a lot of the tanks that are going to be shooting at a TOG II are going to be firing HE, as already mentioned. So one of the modules that gets damaged a lot is your ammo rack. Now, my ammo rack does get damaged quite frequently. However, the reason I decided not to go for a wet ammo rack is I think other equipment choices are more important, and also the TOG II has a rate of fire of 12 rounds a minute. So even when you get ammo racked, at least your rate of fire is still okay. You may not be able to out DPM a lot of other tanks in a one-on-one situation with a damaged ammo rack, but it's still okay. So I thought there were better pieces of equipment, but if you do find yourself getting ammo racked a lot, it's definitely a viable piece of equipment. And finally, a camo net is a complete and utter waste of time on a TOG II. It's a huge tank, it's got very poor camo rating in the first place, and I think it's a complete waste of time. But again, if you're playing on a budget and only have a toolbox, binocs and camo net, it's not going to do it any harm, but I don't think it's going to do any good whatsoever. But yeah, not too many pieces of equipment. There are lots and lots of viable pieces of equipment for a TOG II, depending on how you decide to play the tank. You can play, well, kind of aggressively, but basically just keep it on the move. Or you can play it very, very passively and as a sniper. And really, you can choose equipment based on your own particular playstyle. Lots of viable pieces of equipment. Okay folks, time for the overview game, a game where I show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. We're back on Himmelsdorf, and that's not an accident. The TOG loves Himmelsdorf because it's a small map. It means that RT really doesn't come into effect. It means you can side scrape. It means that you don't get flanked easily. But this is a very different game from the first game I showed you. This is a standard battle. And the first game I was top tier. It was a tier 6 game. This time I'm in a tier 7 game. So this is the worst case scenario for the TOG. On top of that, there is a 3-man TOG platoon on the enemy team. Lots of tier 7 tanks and some dangerous RT. But we also have 3 TOGs. I'm platooned with Beyond D again in a 2-man TOG platoon, although we do have another TOG on our team. And I've shown you this game before. This game was an ace tanker that was on the channel a long time ago. Now, unfortunately, I haven't had time to sit down and play 30 games in a row like I normally do. The first game I showed you in today's review was a game you won't have seen before. I haven't brought it to the channel before. It was original. This one I have brought to the channel before, but I think it's a pretty good example of what the TOG is capable of. As I say, it's a tier 7 game, worst case scenario for the TOG, and I'm going to be trying to do some side scraping. Now, TOG, not known for its armor, but if you know what you're doing, you can side scrape a lot of tanks, even tier 7 tanks. So that's what we're going to try and do here. Now, I don't have much to aim at here, but enemy TOG is down on this corner as well. I'm going for the side of his turret, and you can see that we can pen the side. We're not going for that 114 millimeters of armor. We're going for just the cheek. That's only 65 millimeters of armor. We've penned, we've done our first damage. And we don't have much to shoot at. So unfortunately, as you can see, we've lost the hill. Too many tanks went south. We've lost the hill. And now I've got to relocate. I'm keeping an eye on the minimap, and that's something you really need to do in a TOG. I thought maybe I'd get a shot through the windows here, but I've got to get to safety. The tank is just too slow. It cannot react to what's happening on the battlefield, and as a result, you always have to keep an eye on that minimap. So, at the moment it looked as if we were losing the hill, I'm on the move. But enemy TOG advancing across the open. I saw that on the minimap. I moved into a position. We get 2 shots in, someone else takes him out, and then I've got to stay on the move. Thought I'd have a shot in the Hellcat, but not quite sure what's happening. And now I'm aware that there's a Hellcat directly behind me. And now I know that RT is directly behind me. RT has gone up the hill. So there's no running. I can't get down the D line because that Hellcat's going to be shooting me in the back. I've got to turn and try and help my team. And the KV-3 is moving up. So again, we're going to try and use this corner. We're going to try and do some side scraping here. Going to try and track the KV-3 as he comes around the corner. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is the ammo. The TOG II gets an absolutely insane amount of ammunition. Oh, KV-3 has been backed up by a TOG II, but we're going to try and track him. No, he doesn't come around the corner. But sometimes the alpha damage just lets you down. You don't have enough alpha damage to track a tank. But we're side scraping, waiting for these guys to come around the corner. And I went for a shot to try and knock out the KV-3's gun. If I could get him to use a repair kit in his gun, that means he can't use them on his tracks, but okay. Again, try and track the TOG, and unfortunately just don't have the alpha damage. But TOG II is focused on someone else. KV-3, and we can pen him. He's reversing. TOG II is dead. So now I'm wondering what else I can do. So I'm going to try and do some reverse side scraping maybe. Enemy team have moved up to my right, so again, keeping an eye on the minimap. Full health TOG, and a snapshot misses. So the TOG is focused. Oh, he's angled, so I bounce. Trying to put a shot through that weak spot on his tracks I was telling you about. And the enemy TOG is spamming gold. Oh, Yag Panther! And there we go. I wasn't angled. I took damage. So I wasn't angled, but now I'm going to side scrape. And there we go. We've just bounced the Yag Panther because we're side scraping. So I track the Yag Panther. I'm trying to encourage him to bounce. There we go. We've side scraped a Yag Panther again.
Enemy is hit.
And we can just start working. Is he going to side scrape again? There we go, we've just side scraped him again. You have to know how to side scrape in a TOG. Absolutely have to. My angling is almost perfect here. Now if these guys were able to shoot me in the tracks, they'd probably be able to pen and do damage.
Great shot.
That's what I'm trying to do here. And then a T-150 comes around the corner. So I'm up against some very, very dangerous tanks here. The TOG. Oh, RT. There we go. There's my first kill of the game, but we've been bouncing like a boss. 3 tanks down here. Again, I'm trying to side scrape, trying to get shots in here. I'm a little bit over angled now. And I'm missing. You cannot over angle, unfortunately. But we're just going to work here. And there we go. Shot straight through the track. Track him and put a shot into the 25mm of armor behind the track. I showed you this in Tank Viewer. You can see we can pen him straight through the tracks into 25mm. And we can trade shots. So, enemy TOG was able to pen me twice, but I was able to take him out. Now, at the moment, it is 2 versus 3 right now. And unfortunately, I said that the TOG was good at shooting on the move. Unfortunately, that was a really, really bad miss. I know enemy tanks are now capping. AMX, according to the minimap, is working on the Su-122-44. So I've got a Yag Panther and a T-150 down here. And again, I'm side scraping. And there we go. We bounced the Yag Panther. We bounced the T-150. We're side scraping. We can go to work here, reset the cap. He bounces again. And I bounce my kill shot. Absolutely typical bounce on the kill shot. So T-150 is trying to side scrape. Oh, and Su-122-44 has just gone down. RT's trying to flank me. And I've just got a hint of a shot, but I can't pen him. And the T-150 has come down. So I've got to move. RT was able to hit me. I'm reverse side scraping. Reverse side scraping. We get 2 shots in. T-150 is firing HE because, again, a lot of tanks fire HE at TOGs, thinking they're going to easily be able to penetrate. But I see the RT is trying to flank me, and again, trying to move into cover, trying to stay safe from the TOG, and trying to stay safe from the T-150. Miss my shot on the RT. And now I'm reversing, trying to stay safe from the T-150. Unfortunately, I think he's still going to get a shot into me, but I know what RT is doing. So I'm setting up an ambush. And I don't have enough. And the T-150 can put me... I'm down to 150 health, but I take out RT. Oh, so side scraping. We've got a good gun. We're up to 2.7k damage. But we're down to a 1-hit kill. And I might have to, I have to roll slightly higher than average damage. Has to be a slightly high roll to kill the T-150. And again, I'm trying to side scrape, but now what I'm doing is I'm going hull down. Remember that 114mm of frontal turret armor, I'm going hull down, waiting for this T-150 to come around the corner. He's disappeared. Nope, he's just appeared, so... Get a shot into his weak spot just below the turret, and it's a low roll, so need one more, and he drives around the corner. So Pretty hectic game, but that pretty much showed you guys that even though the TOG II isn't known for its armor, if you're an experienced player, if you know how to side scrape in a TOG II, the armor can be surprisingly good. We took 23 hits in that game, and we came out of it, we only survived with 158 health, but because we had 1400 hit points, because we knew how to side scrape, we were able to bounce a lot of shots. Got a little bit lucky that a lot of tanks were firing HE, but that was one heck of a game. I still have, my heart still races when I watch this replay. So while the TOG II is looked down upon as a tank that has very little armor, when you know what you're doing, when you understand the strengths and weaknesses of the tank and know how to side scrape, the TOG II can be very good, but it is very map dependent. On a big open map, it needs to be played a lot more passively, a lot more like a sniper, a lot more like a support tank, simply because you don't have the speed to keep up with the tanks on the front line, but also because you're a big target, and on a big open map, RT is going to tear you apart. But in the right situations, on a city map like Himmelsdorf or Runeberg, the TOG II can be very good with just a little bit of side scraping. You can pick up steel walls in a TOG II, you can pick up high calibers in a TOG II, because the gun is exceptionally good. I think it's one of the best tier 6 guns in the game, not just on a premium tank, but on any tank. I think it's a very good gun. I do like the TOG II, but I will say it is situational, and it's not a tank I would sit down and play 30 games in a row in. You can earn money in a TOG II, you can bounce. I took 1750 potential damage there, more hit points than my tank. Damaged 8, destroyed 4, did some assistance damage and base defense points, but basically, yeah, that was an older game. I have shown you that game in the past before, but as I say, I'm a little bit stuck for time, don't have time to sit down and play 30 games in a row in the TOG II, so you're going to have to settle for one original game and this one as a replay. But I think the TOG II is hugely underestimated. I think it's a tank that benefits from having a experienced player in it, and if you understand its strengths and weaknesses, which you should do after this review, then I think the TOG II could be very good. Okay folks, time to sum up. Is the TOG II worth 3,500 gold if still available at the time you're watching this video as it's released, or should it appear in the gift shop in the future? Well, the TOG II does have a lot of positives, regardless of the reputation it gets. Starting off with the hit points, it's got an absolutely huge hit point pool. 1,400 hit points on a tier 6 heavy tank. That's almost 50% more hit points than most other tier 6 heavy tanks get. Now you can argue that maybe because the armor isn't fantastic it needs the hit points, but you still can't argue with the fact that 1,400 hit points is almost half the health of a tier 10 mouse. So yes, hit points are definitely a positive. It also gets special matchmaking, possibly the reason it's been removed from the gift shop and tech tree. But its special matchmaking means it will never see tier 8s. It will only see tier 7s, tier 6s and below. So special matchmaking is another big positive for the TOG II. It's also an absolutely amazing crew trainer. I think of all the tanks, or all the premium tanks I have, more crews have gone through the TOG II than any other premium tank I've ever owned. Most of my British tanks, not just heavy tanks, but most of my British tanks have got an either full crew or a partial crew that have been through the TOG II at some stage. It's very good when it comes to crew training. It's also got an absolutely amazing gun. In fact, I would say that this is probably one of the best tier 6 guns in the game, if not the best tier 6 gun in the game. A 17 pounder with a nice rate of fire, incredible penetration, especially for a premium tank. The alpha damage is a little bit low, but you get a rate of fire to match or to make up for that. The accuracy is quite good, and the accuracy is quite good or very good while shooting on the move, because the TOG II is a slow tank. And the aim time, while not fantastic, matches the rate of fire very well. I think the gun is absolutely amazing on this tank, and when you take into consideration things like 10 degrees of gun depression, 114 millimeters of frontal turret armor, the fact it carries a huge amount of ammo, which means you could just spam shot after shot, the fact you don't have to fire very much premium ammo in this tank because the penetration on the gun is so good, I think it's just an amazing gun. And because The ammo costs and the repair costs for the TOG II are very, very low. It also means that the TOG II is a very, very good moneymaker for a Tier 6 premium tank. An average game will net you about 50-60,000 credits, which is very good for a Tier 6 premium tank. Its view range for a Tier 6 heavy tank is actually quite good. May not be fantastic, but for a Tier 6 heavy it's quite good, as is the signal range. So this tank does have a lot of positives. However, it has some very, very, very big negatives. And possibly the biggest negative for the TOG II is its speed, although all the TOG II's weaknesses are very, very interdependent. But mainly, it's the speed for me. At 14 kilometers an hour, the TOG II is one of the slowest tanks in the game, if not the slowest, and you will even struggle to reach 14 kilometers an hour if you're going uphill. It means that the TOG II is very, very inflexible. You cannot react to what's happening on the map. Sometimes it's best when you spawn into a map, depending on the map it is, not to advance at all, just to go hull down in spawn and prepare to defend and snipe, because your tank is just not quick enough to get into any of the usual positions. But assuming you do decide to try and move into a position, your tank is just not quick enough to move into a usual position. If your team are being too aggressive down one flank and you've decided to go down the same flank, all the enemy tanks are dead before you get there. On the other hand, if your team have been too aggressive going down one flank, all your friendlies have died before you get into position and you find yourself being caught out in the open. And you end up being caught out in the open very, very often in a TOG II due to its slow speed. And a TOG that's been caught out in the open is a very, very sad TOG, because it means that the armor is very, very poor. Yes, in some scenarios you can side scrape, you can angle, but you cannot do that on a big open map. And if you've been caught out in the open, enemy RT, enemy tanks are going to tear you to pieces. You're just too slow, you can't avoid RT. TDs have absolutely no problems penning a TOG II, and as I say, you can't angle and you can't side scrape on a map, for example, like Sand River. Even if you manage to find a nice hold down position in a TOG II, RT doesn't care. RT are still going to be focusing you, and RT will always focus TOGs because they know that they've got a lot of hit points. They know that if they can pen a TOG, they're going to do huge amounts of damage and earn a lot of XP and credits as a result. So if you're in a TOG II, expect to take a lot of RT fire. So the speed is a big problem. It makes the tank very, very inflexible, and a lot of that is down to another negative, which is it's map dependent. As I say, a big open map is a TOG's worst nightmare, and sometimes the best thing to do is move a couple of meters outside of spawn and prepare to snipe and defend, because by the time you get into position, either your friendlies are going to die, your friendlies are going to be too aggressive, or you're going to be caught out in the open getting there. However, on a small city map, the TOG II can be very, very good, but I definitely would not say the armor is a strength. I think the armor is just way too map dependent. So it's a very, very situational tank. It's not fun to play, and you won't find very many experienced players playing the TOG II solo. And the reason I'm stressing the word solo is because one of the biggest strengths of a TOG II is when it's platooned. When you have a TOG II on a platoon, and assuming they've got equipment on the tank, you've got 1400 hit points and over 2000 DPM. Now that's quite good, but let's assume you've got a platoon mate in a TOG II. All of a sudden, two of you working together means you've got 2800 hit points and over 4000 DPM. If you have a third player in a TOG II in a platoon, you've got 4,200 hit points. That's roughly the hit points of the rest of your team put together. And not only do you have 4,200 hit points, but you've got over 6,000 DPM. If a TOG II platoon of 3-man TOG II platoon came around a corner and found a KV-85, they would be able to kill that KV-85 in less than 7 seconds. They could kill a KV-85 in less time than it would take for the KV-85 to fire 2 shots. That is the strength of a TOG II platoon, and that's one of the reasons you see a lot of TOG II platoons. Solo TOGs are sad TOGs, and when I see a solo TOG on the enemy team, I'm thinking XP and credits. When I see a TOG II platoon on the enemy team, I'm thinking, well, this could get quite tricky. I'm going to have to be quite careful, because if they're working together, then they are a formidable force. Huge amount of hit points and over 6,000 DPM. They could tear any tank apart, and they've got the hit points to be able to take a lot of shots while doing it. So while the TOG II has a lot of strengths and it has some huge weaknesses, it can be an incredibly frustrating tank to play. But platooning in a TOG II removes a lot of those frustrations, and a TOG II platoon can be absolutely unstoppable. So I am actually going to say that even though this tank makes me want to tear my hair out sometimes, the TOG II is probably worth it, especially if you are a tank collector and the tank is being removed, and especially if you are going to be platooning up with other TOG II drivers. A TOG II platoon, absolutely amazing. And even when you play the TOG II solo, you can have some great games. I may have been platooned in today's games in the review, but for most of those games I was playing pretty much solo. I wasn't playing with Beyond D. He was on the other flank or playing on another part of the map. You can have great games in a TOG II solo, but you can have absolutely amazing games when you're platooned. Of course, as I say, it's going to be frustrating sometimes. Sometimes your TOG II platoon is going to get absolutely annihilated due to the fact that the TOG II is map dependent, even for platoons. But this is a very rare tank. It is a very, very unusual tank, and while it may be frustrating to play now and again, I still think if you have friends who've got TOG IIs and you're willing to platoon, I think the tank is worth it. Even solo, I think the tank can be okay. You've just got to remember, play passively on some maps, play aggressively on other maps, but overall, I think the tank can be quite good. It's just not a tank I'm willing to sit down and play 30 games in a row in. I'll play the TOG on occasion, I'll play it when people request it. It can be fun to play, but as I say, it can also be frustrating as hell to play. But overall, it's not that expensive. It's a decent money maker. It's a very, very good crew trainer. It's got a great gun. And really, the TOG II needs to be experienced. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it, but more likely than not, if you're platooned in a TOG II, you're going to love it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.